During the week, I had a photo pop up on my Facebook feed. It wasn't, I don't quite know why it was popping up, because this is the photo. If I can get the photo up there. Have I lost it? No, there it is. It wasn't quite 2 years ago, because I think their official anniversary is in 3 days' time. So why is it popping up on my Facebook feed a week before their anniversary? Not sure, but never mind. This popped up on my Facebook feed during the week. And it was a wedding that I did for Brendan and Monique. And it actually reminded me of a great story that fitted into my sermon. So maybe that's why Facebook knew I was looking for an opening illustration and gave it to me instead. So the bride's family were members of Hillsong Church, and so the wedding was actually in at Hillsong, in the Hillsong Chapel, not in the 4,000-seat auditorium that they've got there, but rather in the chapel that they've built there as well. But I was pretty excited because here I was going to be front and centre at a Hillsong event. How cool is that? You know, I actually wanted to see whether or not they might change the name for the day to the Hillsong Chapel. Either way, I was just pretty excited to be the main person in a Hillsong event on Hillsong campus. It was going to be great. And they had the practice the night before. And when we turned up for the practice at the Hillsong Chapel, there was lots of, not only was the bride and the groom and all the attendants there for the practice, there was a bunch of other people hanging around. Hillsong official people, the tech crew, because if you do anything at Hillsong, they have to have this tech crew there, but also other people hanging around. It was felt a bit like they're checking out who's come to do this wedding in their chapel. And so they were all looking at me, and I really wanted to show them just how, I don't know, hip and charismatic and in charge I was. And so I jumped up on the stage and I said in my most charismatic voice, "Okay, everybody, gather around, we're going to get started." I took a step back and tripped over a foldback speaker and did this spectacular roll onto the stage. It literally was the pride before the fall. I didn't see the foldback speaker there at all. I did not see it at all. And sometimes when it comes to trip hazards in life, we don't see them before we trip over them either. They take us a little bit by surprise, and before we know, we're ended up sprawled all over the ground as well. In life, there are many spiritual trip hazards or just everyday trip hazards. And I don't know, these things can not only make us look silly as we trip up, but they can also stop us on our momentum moving forward, whether that's in life or whether that's in our spiritual growth. It can actually hinder our spiritual growth if we're not careful of these trip hazards. So I guess the question that I've got is, how do we be aware of these things, and how can we, avoid tripping up? Not only so we don't embarrass ourselves, but also so we don't lose momentum in our spiritual journey. So today and over the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at some of these spiritual trip hazards that are actually all in our lectionary readings that we have over this week and the next 2 weeks. Things like hypocrisy and distraction and fear through the eyes of these gospel readings that Matthew has recorded from us, these words of Jesus. But I want to say up front that I'm not doing this to make anybody feel judged or feel guilty or feel like we're pointing fingers at people. That is not my intention at all. And I want to make sure that both people online and people in the building, you're very clear on that. I'm not preaching this because I know your situation and I've written a sermon for you. That's not what I've done, okay? Instead, look, I'll admit myself, I've been tripped up in these 3 areas myself. So I'm the last person to start pointing fingers. So I'm not here to belittle people or to make people feel guilty. But at the same time, I want to be real, because these things are real and these things can trip us up. And I think it's good in a church family to address real issues. And after all, my goal is to help people to spiritually grow, and if being aware of trip hazards help us to spiritually grow, then that's why we're doing this. So in our Bible reading for today, Jesus jumps straight in looking at the issue of hypocrisy. And while it's not a topic that we would normally like to talk about in church, it's a topic that is unfortunately associated with the church. I went looking and I found a survey. It was from America and it is a number of years old. But this survey, where they asked a bunch of people who are not regular churchgoers, what's a word that they associate with the church? And you would hope it might be things like, I don't know, loving or compassionate or faithful. But you know the word that was number one, don't you? Hypocrites. Hypocrites. Why do people outside the church associate this word with us? It's not a word that we want people to think about when they think about the church. So what is a hypocrite? What is hypocrisy? Well, I looked up a couple of definitions. The Cambridge Dictionary defines it as somebody who, so they have a particular moral belief but believes in a way that shows that they are not sincere. And dictionary.com's a little bit more blunt. They say a hypocrite is a person who pretends to have virtues, morals or religious beliefs or principles that he or she does not actually possess, especially the person whose actions belie stated beliefs. I don't know, even reading that, we start to get uncomfortable going, why do people associate that sort of stuff with the church? The association with this word hypocrisy are other words like lying or being fake or lack of integrity or not being genuine. Now, I'm not saying that the church is full of hypocrites. I'm not saying that. But it's just hard to think that other people associate that with the church. So Jesus in our Bible reading was addressing this whole issue of hypocrisy. And in a sense, he was directing a lot of these comments to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who were part of the crowd. There was two different groups of people who were watching. There was the Pharisees and teachers of the law, but there was also the ordinary people who were also listening at this time. But he was directing it more at the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And Jesus highlights a few different ways that the teachers of the law and the Pharisees were being hypocritical. And maybe this is the place where we can start. If we look at what Jesus was saying to them, I'll let God speak to us in however way God wants to speak to us this morning. So let's just step through some of this passage that David read out for us today and see what God says to us through some of these verses. Let's start at verse 1. Jesus said to the crowds, and the teacher of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. A couple of weeks ago, I'm saying we need to understand the context of this. Do people know what that line means? They sit in Moses' seat. What do? We Google it, which I did. It basically comes back and says that the teachers of the law are the officials, interpreters of the law of Moses. They've been the ones who've been trained, who do this to help people understand what the law of Moses is about. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law do that role, so therefore they sit in Moses' seat. In today's term, we would say that the people trained in biblical studies would sit in Moses' seat, or we might say the ordained people or the reverends, so to speak, would be sitting in Moses' seat because, I've done biblical studies at university to help me do that. Does it make sense? So that's what Jesus was basically just acknowledging the role that these people had. They're the official interpreters of the Bible. But then he goes on to say a really tough line in verse 3. He says, if these people are the official interpreters, then you got to listen to what they say. They do know what they're talking about. They've had studies in this area. You got to listen to what they say. So you must be careful to do everything that they tell you to do because they're interpreting the law for you. But then he goes on and says, but don't do what they do. don't do what they do because they don't practice what they preach. That's a tough line, isn't it? Listen to what they say because the interpretation they're giving is correct, but don't follow their actions because they're not reflecting that in their life, which is the classic definition of hypocrisy, isn't it? When we say one thing, but we do another. That's what hypocrisy in its clearest sense is. And Jesus is accusing the Pharisees and the teachers of the law of doing that. What they're saying is right, but what they're doing doesn't reflect that. So do we ever get tripped up by this? Of saying one thing, but doing another? I wonder whether this is one of the main reasons that people outside the church sometimes get this perception that we're hypocritical, because they can see this dislocation between what we say and what we do. We might preach on being forgiving and gracious, but then they see us holding grudges or being mean, and they say that doesn't line up. Mind you, I do get frustrated that I can, be wonderfully compassionate and gracious and show all these wonderful characteristics, and then I get tired and I might get angry at one moment and somebody says, and you call yourself a Christian. I go, have you not seen everything else I just did? I do think that that's unfair. However, I guess they're just highlighting that I'm saying one thing in that moment and not doing another. Now, I would argue that we're never going to be perfect at this. We are never going to get to a point that all our actions reflect our beliefs and our the things that we say, because we're human. But still, that should be our goal, shouldn't it? We should try to the best of our abilities to reflect our words and our beliefs in our actions. That should be our goal, and that's what Jesus is saying. That's what our goal should be. We should try and be, to the best of our ability, as genuine as we possibly can be. Anyway, verse 4, Jesus goes on and says, still talking to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law mainly, they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. I found this picture on a liberation website yesterday. I found it quite confronting of just the different imageries that was put up there, but the artist drew it on that verse. They tie up heavy loads but don't lift a finger. At the time that Jesus was saying this, I was explaining the other week about the 613 laws. Was that in the morning congregation? It was, wasn't it? The 10 Commandments, yes. So we're talking about these laws that were given from Mount Sinai. But what the Pharisees and the teachers of the law went on, in their interpretations of that, they would say, well, the law says this, but this is how it's played out in practice. And some of those interpretations were very onerous, And it was almost like, well, it's fine for you whose whole job is to follow these laws. But for the ordinary person trying to live an ordinary life, the burdens that you're putting on them are just too hard. And Jesus himself got frustrated with this and would push back against this when he was saying, your interpretation of that law is not right. So like when he would heal a person on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law would say, no, you're not allowed to do that. That is working. Under our interpretation of that law, that is working, and you're not allowed to do that. And Jesus would push back and go, if a donkey fell in a hole, you would get the donkey out, wouldn't you? Why can't I heal on the Sabbath? So Jesus himself was pushing back to say, your interpretation is too strict. It's missing the point of what this law was supposed to be about. The Sabbath is supposed to be about spending time with God and spending time with your family and the people that you love. It's not about being worried about whether you're going to accidentally do something that puts a cross next to your name. That's not the point of what the Sabbath is about. I was reading a sermon by Edward Marquardt, who said about this verse, it said, The Pharisees' hypocrisy was by focusing on the people's adherence to the finer details of the law, that they were actually missing the bigger picture, that God was calling them to live lives of love and justice and mercy. And I just went, wow, that's a really interesting statement, isn't it? That sense of they're so worried about the details that they're missing what the law is actually encouraging them to do. And Jesus goes on only about, 12 verses later in the same chapter and really rips up the Pharisees. If you want to keep reading chapter 23, it gets really to the point where he basically says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. So he's once again saying to them, what you're doing in terms of the law is not wrong. But when you miss the big picture, it doesn't make any sense. So focus on the big picture, justice and mercy and faithfulness, and then start to worry about whether or not you're tithing your spices right. Can you see what Jesus is trying to say? Don't miss the big picture. And maybe that's another way that we can understand hypocrisy. Getting so caught up with the details that we miss the bigger picture of what God is trying to say or God is trying to do. Sorry? I just want to pick up on the last few verses in that first block of the Bible reading where the third aspect that Jesus addresses in verses 5 through to 7 or 8 was this practice of wanting to do things, so we wanted to influence the way that people see us or think about us or have a perception of us. Jesus criticised the Pharisees for making sure that the outer signs of their spirituality, their tassels and their box on their forehead, I can't even remember what the word is. David said it so clearly and so well when he did the Bible reading. So the phylacteries, that's what the word I'm trying to think of, yes. So you're saying the outward signs, they're not important as what's going on the inside. And he says, you're only doing these things because you want people to think highly of you and to give you honour and to give you the best seats at the table, or to call you a rabbi, which means a great teacher, not just any teacher, but a great teacher. Now, I would say that we don't worry about what other people think of us, do we? I don't know. We probably struggled just as much as the Pharisees on this one, doing things because we want other people to think highly or more highly of us, which is literally the thing that tripped me up at my Hillsong experience, isn't it? I was so busy wanting to look like I was hip and cool and charismatic that I wasn't looking for the speaker standing right behind me. It's crazy. I was invited to do the wedding because Brendan and Monique wanted me to do their wedding, not because I needed to somehow prove to the Hillsong tech crew that I was worthy of doing it in their chapel. Another sermon I read, one by Elizabeth Lovell Milford, she said on this topic that we've got to make sure we don't be too hard on ourselves, because she says it's human to want to matter. It's human to want to be important or to be honoured. We all want to be known and loved. She goes on to say, it's important for us to feel like we matter and be appreciated. She says, that's not the bad thing. It's okay to feel that. But she said, when it becomes the focus, the sole focus of what we are doing, that we're only doing that because we want people to think highly of us, when it dominates our thinking and everything that we do, then it becomes problematic, she says. And I think she's right. There's a line somewhere in there between wanting to be valued and wanting to, do things so that people go, well done. But when it becomes the dominating thing, I'm only doing this because I want those people to think this of me, then it can become problematic. and maybe is another aspect of hypocrisy that Jesus is talking about in this passage. I said at the beginning, I didn't want this to be guilt-inducing, and yet I don't know how you're feeling, but even when I was writing this, I was starting to feel a bit, this is a bit too close to home. I'm feeling this. But then I thought, well, maybe is that just God speaking to me as I'm writing this sermon, going, to me personally, here's some things that you need to be reflecting on a bit more. And if you're feeling that, then maybe God is saying that to you. I do believe that God is calling us to be more genuine in our faith. If we believe something or place value on something, then that should be reflected in our lives. If we are hearing God saying that we might get focused too much on the detail rather than on the bigger picture, that we're missing the bigger picture, then maybe we need to stop and take a step back and look at the bigger picture and then move into the finer details again. Or maybe God is saying for us not to worry too much about what other people are thinking, but first realize that our worth comes from the fact that we are children of God. Be more worried about what God is thinking of us than what other people are thinking of us. I don't know how God is speaking to you today through all of this, but I'll let God do that. I'll say again, we are never going to be perfect in these areas. So don't feel that sense of overwhelming guilt or shame if you're going, well, I'm not good, I'm not perfect. Well, we're not going to be. But still, it should be our goal to strive to do better in all of these areas. That's what Jesus is encouraging the Pharisees and teachers of the law to do better. I don't know about you. Have you noticed that ever since we've been into COVID, there's been more cords around on the floor of the church? Not today, because the television was pushed back, and I suddenly realised that earlier in the service. I thought, my whole point of my sermon was going to talk about the cords on the floor, and they're not on the floor to this morning. But if you're watching online, normally we have televisions and power cords running across the front of the church so that we can see things and be able to work out what the live stream is doing and stuff like that. Initially at the beginning, we had cameras sitting right in front and there was cords everywhere. And talking about a trip hazard, they were everywhere. You had to be careful. And during that time, I don't know if you've ever seen these around. Have you seen these yet? We bought them. If you haven't seen them, they're doing their job. And what they are, they're just big Velcro straps on one side, but you can put a cord along the floor and then stick this over it, and it becomes less of a trip hazard. You're less likely to trip over it. If you put this over, can you still trip on it? Well, yes, you still can. But the probability of you tripping on it is less because this thing is there. Does that make sense? And I want to pick up, and right at the very beginning of my service, took my main point of my sermon, which I was actually really impressed with, Anne. The whole point of something like these trip hazards is to be aware of them and to work out what we can do to minimise the risk that they will trip us up. And so what is our, Velcro strip in our spiritual life that we can be using to minimise the risk that we will trip up? I think Anne hit the nail on the head with some of them when she says, if we focus on God, that will be a way that we can trip up less if our eyes are on Jesus. And I agree with that. I also think prayer is an extraordinarily helpful thing to minimise trip hazards. If we are, close in our prayer relationship with God, that does help. That does help. But Jesus himself, in the end of our Bible reading, gives us another hint of how to, find one of these, strips that we can reduce the trip hazard, so to speak. At the end of his Bible reading, Jesus says this: if you don't want to be tripped up by hypocrisy, he said, the greatest among you will be your servant, and those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus said there is something about taking on the attitude of a servant, of serving people, that helps you not get tripped up by hypocrisy. If you take on a more humble way of life, that's not putting down yourself, that's just being more aware of the people around you, then you are less likely to be tripped up by hypocrisy, Jesus is saying. Or as another translation put it, the Passion Translation, because I'm trying to model what I taught the other week about using more than one translation. It says this: the greatest among you will be the one who always serves others from the heart. Remember this: if you have a lofty opinion of yourself and seek to be honoured, you'll be humbled. But if you have a modest opinion of yourself and choose to humble yourself, then you will be honoured. I did find it interesting. After I did my big tumble on the Hillsong stage, it was a little bit of a wake-up call when I realised my goal here is not to impress the Hillsong people. My goal here is to help Brendan and Monique get married. And that's what we did. And so Brendan and Monique didn't make their wedding promises to each other sitting on the Hillsong chapel stage. And it was a beautiful service. It went really, really well. And I was not tripped up, largely because the Hillsong tech people made sure there was no speaker anywhere near me for the entire service. My challenge for you today and my encouragement for you today is that may we all be genuine in our love, in our lives, in our faith. Amen.